Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the witness. You're very welcome. I want to return to an area of questioning that Deputy O'Donnell raised earlier, if I may, and it's in relation to the introduction of the new regulatory structure in 2003. When that new structure was put in place, do you believe that there were effective instruments available to it to deal with excessive credit growth and sector risk concentration?
Yes, I do believe that, but I suppose the approach to regulation would have made it very difficult for them to use those, but they were there. For example, you could attach conditions to a license. There were a number of things you could do.
They had sufficient powers to regulate the banks?
I think so, yeah.
When things like sectoral limits were breached by individual banks, would the department be made aware of this by the regulator?
No. I think the whole business about sectoral limits is a very complex issue. First of all, there were only guidelines from the regulator. That's the first thing. The second thing was the introduction of Basel II effectively took a different approach to this by requiring capital as a solution to these sort of things. But no, the department was well at arm's length away from individual.
But you, as a member of the board of the central bank, would you have been made aware when breaches were reported to the regulator?
No, because there was a decision taken not to have the Department of Finance represented on the board of the regulator.
But when the regulator then, when things were reported to the actual central bank, the CBFSAI board, which had oversight role,
yes. Well,
would those things be reported into that board?
No, it didn't have an oversight role. It's important. It had a role in relation to stability, and the two organisations came together to input into the annual financial stability report, and the two boards came together to approve that financial stability report.
Okay. But then, from your recollection, from your time on the board, you do not remember breaches of sectoral concentration limits being discussed then in that process?
No.
Okay. Did the department review the establishment of the new structure at all in the years following its establishment when you were Secretary General of the Department of Finance?
No, actually, it was very early days. Like the first strategy statement that it was required to produce under the Act covered the period up to the end of 2004. And there was only one annual report, actually, I think, published during my time. So it would have been, it would have been pretty early days to do that.
Okay. You mentioned this, but also Patrick Neary mentioned it as well when he was before us about the limits being more of a guideline. Why were they only a guideline?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't talk about things that I wasn't involved in. I didn't.
But would it not fall to the Department of Finance in terms of the legislation to establish the regulator, whether or not things like sectoral limits would be guidelines or be strict rules to be enforced?
Well, no. I mean, that would be very much, I think, the day-to-day operation of regulation. The Department of Finance was more concerned with structures and so on like that. And if you read, say, virtually all the documentation, including McDowell, I mean, there was more or less universal agreement that the regulator should have autonomy on its day-to-day regulation.
But when Mr. Neary tells us, as he did, and it's on page 31 of the transcript from his session here, that there was no legal or supervisory remedy in relation to breaches of the limit, the question is, should there have been? And if so, did this responsibility not fall to the department?
It would if the regulator had come to us and said, there's a deficiency in the legislation.
But the regulator never came to you and said it's
not that I can recall anyway.
Were deficiencies ever discussed during your time on the board on the central bank?
No. Insofar as I can recall, and I spent 2 days reviewing the minutes of the boards of IFSRA and the central bank. And when you review the minutes, and I have to be careful about this, but generally, the general impression you get was that regulation was being conducted as you'd expect And I had some experience of regulation, so I would have been looking at it fairly critically, and it appeared to me to be normal.
Okay. But just to clarify that, the regulator never came to you looking for...
But not that I can recall.
Okay. When the chairman of the regulator, Mr. Patterson, was before us, on page 111 of his transcript, he said that the sector concentration limits were relaxed in the 1990s to attract one particular large foreign bank, and as a result, the limits were then relaxed for everyone.
I heard him saying that, yes.
Would you care to comment?
I don't know. It's news to me. I didn't know about that.
You don't recall the concentration has been weakened in the 1990s for one particular bank?
No.
Okay. And you don't recall any discussion of that then later on in relation to sector concentration limits?
No.
Okay. I'll move on from that then, if I may, to the Wright report. You've read the Wright report, I think. Do you accept its findings?
That's a very broad statement. I suppose the first thing about the Wright report is that he found that the department was fit for purpose, that its advice had been generally stronger and clearer than was available anywhere else. He makes points about the strengthening of the skills. I've dealt with that already. I agree that was a constant issue to build up the skills and so on. So some of the things that he says I wouldn't agree with, but
those things to you and ask if you agree with them.
Yeah.
On page 23 of the Wright report, the public and policymakers were insufficiently sensitive to the effects of extraordinarily expansive monetary conditions at the time, and to the fact that fiscal policy was the key potential counterbalance to this pressure. Does this finding apply to you in your role at the top of the department?
Well, I suppose he doesn't actually say what period he's talking about.
That's why I'm asking if it applies to you in your role.
In the 4 years I was secretary. I don't think so, and I took some trouble to set out in my witness statement why I believe that to be the case and the steps that we took to actually try and, if you like, damp down expenditure as best we could.
So on page 25 of the Wright report, paragraph 3.3.7, as the representatives of the public service employers, the Department of Finance had an important input into the partnership process and consistently warned of growing threats to competitiveness, but did not drive the process and was reluctant to oppose packages that included outcomes that retained labour peace for the economy as a whole. Would that be true for your tenure?
Well, first of all, I think the Department of Finance, through the public service side of it, was the employer, if you like, in those talks for the public service. So that's the first thing. I think in some other report it notes there, I forget where it is now, but that essentially the unions and the private sector representatives tended to dominate the settlement, and then it was applied to the public service, sometimes with pay pauses of 6 months or whatever. But the idea that we didn't, the document I submitted with my witness statement, clearly shows that we were anchoring the advice we gave on competitiveness. It was a big issue, and also on the, if you like, the upcoming calls on the exchequer over a long period out to 2050. So I don't know whether he had a sight of these. I don't know that. And we would have submitted those to the government, and absolutely fed in. There were 4 principal officers from Expenditure Division on the one that reported in 2003.
Reflecting on the graph we looked at earlier in relation to the memorandum in June and the budget decisions in December, Wright also says on that same page 25, relatively clear advice to Cabinet in June on the risks of excessive spending and tax reductions was lost by the time of December budgets. Spending pressures of this magnitude could have been resisted even within the established budget process.
Well,
so do you accept that?
No, I don't.
You couldn't have resisted the pressures that were coming?
Well, it wasn't for civil servants to make those decisions. The reality of government is that these are decisions that are made by ministers and eventually, approved by the government.
Were they making those decisions with the appropriate advice? I asked that because on page 32 of the Wright report, there was no analysis or advice on the broader risks to the tax system from a more general downturn in economic activity from levels created in part by pro-cyclical fiscal policy. such analysis should have been provided and communicated forcefully to the Minister for Finance and the government. Did they have the information to make those decisions?
I think so, but I wouldn't be so defensive as to say that this couldn't be presented in a different way. I mean, one of the things that Wright, talks about, and he's not the only one who does this, is that there was a tendency for the advice to come on the financial side from the governor of the central bank and the regulator direct to the minister. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't know about it. Obviously, we got the letters, and I was on the board of the central bank. So, I'm not going to say there couldn't have been a better presentation of this.
Just a final question, because I'm out of time. You said earlier on, we weren't successful in making our advice stick. So were the decisions taken in the budget contrary to the advice of the department?
Well, not alone were they contrary to the advice of the department, they were contrary to the advice of the Minister for Finance as well, as presented at mid-year when the strategy was set. So as the year went on then, in the autumn, the pressures within the system meant that advice was relaxed and the spending was greater for, as you saw there, for most years apart from 2003. Spending and tax.
The budgets decided after 2003 were decided contrary to the advice the Department of Finance was giving for that budget year.
But I'd like to stress again, in relation to the strategy set by the Minister and the Department, both of them together, I went to some trouble to set out for the 2006 budget how that worked. It started in February. The Department set out a stall, said, this is the way we think budgets should be determined for this country. They should be anchored on competitiveness. They should take account of the things that we can see down the road. On that basis, we think gross current expenditure should increase by 6.6%. In the event, the memorandum that went to the government had a 7.5% figure, which isn't, unreasonable. It's from there on, in the autumn, engaging with the other departments, it wasn't possible to hold that line.